During the summer last year, I was a college student working the night shift at a supermarket. Most nights were painfully boring. After midnight, there were barely any customers coming in, so I would usually just sit behind the counter, waiting for my shift to end. The other person in the store with me was Marcus, the closing manager, who was usually somewhere in the back doing paperwork or counting the inventory. Around 1 a.m., I was sitting at the counter like usual, when all of a sudden, everything went dark. All the lights shut off, and the entire supermarket went completely silent. For a second, I just sat there, staring into the darkness before Marcus came out from the back with a flashlight. He said that it was probably a power outage, which was obviously annoying. Marcus handed me another flashlight and told me to go pull down the insulated night curtains over the refrigerated sections of the store before the food started warming up. He stayed at the front of the store while I headed toward the back. The flashlight was strong, but it barely illuminated anything, so I was basically navigating in the darkness. I walked aisle after aisle until I finally reached the back wall where the dairy and meat coolers were located. I walked over to the coolers, and one by one, I pulled down the thick plastic thermal curtains that covered the refrigerators. Everything else was completely quiet, except for the sound of the plastic sheets sliding down. I finally reached the last cooler, and as I grabbed the handle, the light from my flashlight drifted toward the large double doors that led into the warehouse. And as it did, I looked up and saw that there was someone standing between the doorway that led into the warehouse. The person wasn't moving. He was just standing there in complete silence. I remember freezing for a second before I instinctively called out, "Who's there?" The person didn't answer. Instead, he slowly stepped back into the warehouse until he completely disappeared from sight. And as soon as he went inside, I stood up and sprinted toward the doors of the warehouse. I grabbed the handle and slammed the door shut, locking it from the outside. The warehouse was small, so it didn't have any doors or windows. This was the only entrance. I immediately turned around and ran straight back to the front of the store. Marcus looked up as I reached the counter. I yelled at him that there was someone inside the warehouse and told him to immediately call the police. Marcus didn't hesitate. He immediately called 911, and we waited at the front of the store for the cops to show up. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived, and we directed them toward the warehouse. They unlocked the warehouse and went inside, while we waited outside the supermarket. I remember me and Marcus stood outside and waited out there for quite a while. Finally, the officers emerged from the store and walked over to us. The officers looked genuinely confused. They told us that they had searched the entire warehouse, top to bottom, but there was nobody inside. I told them that it was impossible since I had clearly seen someone walk inside the warehouse. Marcus explained that the warehouse had no windows and no other exit, so whoever it was must be inside. The officers nodded, but I could tell that they didn't seem convinced. They said that they had searched the entire store and every corner of the warehouse with their flashlight, but they found nothing. There were no unlocked doors and no sign of forced entry. There was nothing that explained how someone could have gotten inside or escaped the store. Eventually, the police left, leaving both of us standing there, trying to make sense of what the hell had just happened. Marcus suggested that I was tired, and maybe I imagined it since this was my first time working the night shift after all. But I didn't buy that. I clearly remember seeing a person standing in that doorway, and I clearly remember watching that person step back into the warehouse. I just can't wrap my head around the fact that the warehouse was completely empty. It was impossible. I know it sounds crazy, and I could probably chalk it up to be just my imagination. But I know it was real. It was way too real to be imagined. One summer night, I ran out of a few things at home, so around midnight, I drove to the nearest supermarket to pick them up. When I walked in, I didn't see anybody else in the supermarket since it was pretty late after all. I grabbed a shopping basket and started walking through the aisles, picking up the things that I needed for the week. I remember I was in one of the back aisles scanning through a shelf of cereal boxes looking for a specific brand, when all of a sudden, a man walked over and stood right next to me. He looked to be around somewhere in his 30s, and he was wearing a white tank top that showed tattoos running down both of his arms. He smiled at me, and then he just casually asked me if I knew where the cooking oil was. I pointed toward the next aisle where all the cooking supplies were, and I figured that was the end of the conversation. But instead of leaving, he actually stayed there. He suddenly started making small talk, asking me questions like where I was from, whether I lived nearby, or did I always shop this late. I tried answering politely at first, but the guy just wouldn't leave. So I tried ignoring him and kept trying to distance myself from him. But he would just follow me and kept trying to talk to me. I genuinely started feeling uneasy at this point. So I finally turned to him and said that I was in a rush and that I would really appreciate if he would just leave me so I can shop in peace. I saw his expression change the second he heard that, but he reluctantly nodded and walked away without saying another word. I let out a sigh of relief as he walked away. I figured that was the end of it and I could finally continue shopping. But just a few minutes later, I remember I was comparing different brands of pasta in one of the aisles, when all of a sudden, I noticed someone standing at the end of the aisle. I looked over and saw that it was the same man from before. It didn't seem like he was looking at any of the products. Instead, he was just randomly scanning the shelves, almost like he was pretending to shop. And the moment our eyes met, he turned and quietly walked away. But unfortunately, it didn't stop there. I saw him again in the frozen food section, and then again near the drinks. Every time I entered a new aisle, he was always there. And despite the fact that he wasn't talking to me or looking directly at me, I was almost sure that he was watching me. By this point, I was really starting to get creeped out by all this. I was literally being stalked by a random stranger in a supermarket in the middle of the night. I knew how dangerous this situation was, so I quickly grabbed the last few items on my list and headed straight for the checkout. I honestly just wanted to leave as fast as I could. While I was paying on the front counter, I kept glancing around, trying to see where the man was. But I didn't see him anywhere. For a moment, I was actually relieved that he might have actually left the store. I finally paid for my groceries, and then pushed the doors open and walked outside the store. But as soon as I exited the supermarket, I glanced ahead at my car, and I swear my stomach dropped. That man was now standing outside in the parking lot, and he was standing near my car. He wasn't doing anything in particular. It seemed like he was just standing there, looking at the car and just randomly scanning the area. But there was absolutely no way I was going to my car alone. Who knew what the heck he might actually do to me? So instead, I immediately turned around and went back inside the supermarket. I walked up straight to the front counter and quietly explained to the employee what had been happening. The employee immediately called the store manager. The manager listened to what I was saying, and then he quickly walked over to the front windows and looked outside. Then he came back and offered to escort me to my car. I was honestly beyond grateful that he said that. So we stepped outside the store and started walking toward my car. And the moment that man noticed that I wasn't alone, he looked at us for a few seconds. Then he turned around and walked toward an old black sedan that was parked across the parking lot. He got inside the car and quietly drove away without ever looking back. The manager stayed with me until I put all my groceries in the car and got into the driver's seat. I thanked him several times for his help. He was honestly a lifesaver for me in that situation. I finally drove home after that, and thankfully, that was the last I ever saw of that man. I don't know what that guy was trying to do or what his intentions were, but it's obvious that they weren't any good. I'm just glad that I was able to get out of that situation safely, because who knew what he might have done if I had actually walked out of that supermarket alone that night. I was a broke college student looking for a part-time job to help pay for my rent and tuition. After applying everywhere for weeks without any luck, I finally found a listing for a night shift cashier position at a small supermarket on the edge of town. The pay immediately caught my attention. It was almost double than what every other supermarket in the area was offering. I thought it was strange, but at the time, I was desperate for money, so I didn't question it. I showed up for my shift at around 10 p.m. The manager gave me a quick tour of the building and explained that my job was pretty simple. I would basically spend the entire night at the front counter, with occasionally restocking the shelves if needed. The other employee that was supposed to be working with me that night had actually called in sick, which meant that I was basically the only one left inside the building. It wasn't too big of a supermarket, but I still found it weird that they were completely fine with leaving the entire store with me. At first, everything felt normal. I basically just sat at the counter and scrolled through my phone the entire time since there were barely any customers coming in at this hour. Then at around 2 a.m., I stood up and walked over to one of the back aisles and started restocking and organizing the shelves. And as I was doing that, just a few minutes later, I suddenly heard the front entrance of the store open. The supermarket had automatic sliding doors that made a very distinct electronic sound every time somebody entered. I thought a customer had finally came in, so I stood up from my place and walked back to the front counter. But when I actually got there, I realized that the entrance doors were closed and there was no one inside. I figured that the customer might have already walked further into the store, so I looked around the aisles, expecting to see someone shopping. But there was no one. No one had actually came in, and the entire place was empty. I stood there for a few seconds, confused. The front entrance made a very distinct sound every time it opened, so I knew I definitely heard it, but seemingly no one had came in. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had probably imagined it or something, and so I decided to go back to work. But after that, something about that place felt different. I don't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was somebody else inside that building with me. Every time I looked down one of the long aisles, it just felt like someone was watching me. But despite that feeling, I just told myself that was probably because I wasn't used to being in this place yet, since I was new. So I ignored it and just kept working. Around 3 in the morning, I needed more supplies for restocking, so I went to the storage room at the back of the store. The storage room itself was dimly lit. I walked over to the far end of the room and started shuffling through the boxes, and then I slowly began loading the items in the cart. But then, from somewhere inside the darkness of the storage room, I heard a deep, terrifying voice shout my name, echoing through the entire room. The voice didn't sound human at all, and it was so unbelievably loud and deep that for a second, I thought I was going to faint. I immediately dropped what I was holding and ran straight out of the storage room and back to the front counter. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely breathe. After standing in the hallway for almost a minute, I finally worked up the courage to go to the manager's office and pull up the security cameras. But that just made things even worse for me. I looked at the camera footage and saw that every single camera feed showed that the entire supermarket was completely empty. The aisles, the front entrance, the storage room, they were all empty. Which meant that despite me hearing that scream loud and clear in the storage room, according to the cameras, I was the only person inside that building. I spent the rest of my shift sitting behind the counter, constantly checking the monitors. I didn't even bother finishing the restocking. I was completely done with this place. When the manager arrived in the morning, I told him everything, and then I quit my job on the spot. There was absolutely no way I was going to work in that supermarket again. Even now, I have no idea who or what was inside that building with me that yelled out my name. I just know that whatever it was, it definitely did not welcome me in that place that night.